There was a certain professor of religion named Dr. Christiansen, who taught at a small college in the western United States. Dr. Christiansen taught the required survey course in Christianity. And at this particular institution, every student was required to take this course his or her freshman year, regardless of his or her major. Although Dr. Christiansen tried hard to communicate the essence of the gospel in his class, he found that most of his students looked upon the course as nothing but required drudgery. Despite his best efforts, most students refused to take Christianity seriously. This year, Dr. Christiansen had a special student named Steven. Steve was only a freshman, but was studying in the intent of going into the seminary for the ministry. Steve was popular. He was well liked, and he was imposing a physical specimen. He was now starting center on the school football team and was the best student in the professor's class. One day, Dr. Christiansen asked Steve to stay after the class so he could talk with him. "How many push-ups can you do?" Steve said. "I do 200 every night." 200? That's pretty good, Steve. Dr. Christiansen said, "Do you think you could do 300? Steve replied, "I don't know. I've never done 300 at a time." "Do you think you could do?" again asked Dr. Christiansen. "Well, I can try," said Steve. "Can you do 300 in sets of 10? I have a class project in mind, and I need you to do about 300 push-ups in sets of 10 for this to work. Can you do it?" "I need you to tell me you can do it," said the professor. Steve said, "Well, I think I can. Yeah, I can do it." Dr. Christiansen said, "Good. I need you to do this on Friday. Let me explain what I have in mind." Friday came and Steve got to class early and sat in front of the room. When the class started, these weren't the normal kinds. When the class started, the professor pulled out a big box of donuts. These weren't the normal kinds of donuts. These were the extra fancy, big, with cream, centers, and frosting swirls. Everyone was pretty excited. It was Friday, the last class of the day, and they were going to get an early start on the weekend with the party in Dr. Christiansen's class. Dr. Christiansen went to the first girl in the first row and asked, "Cynthia, do you want to have one of these donuts?" Cynthia said yes. Dr. Christiansen then turned to Steve and asked Steve, "Would you do 10 push-ups so that Cynthia can have a donut?" "Sure." Steve jumped down from his desk to do a quick 10. Then Steve again sat in his desk. Dr. Christiansen put a donut on Cynthia's desk. Then Dr. Christiansen then went to Joe, the next person, and asked Joe, "Do you want a donut?" Joe said yes. Dr. Christensen asked, Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Joe can have a donut? Steve did 10 push-ups and Joe got a donut. And so it went down the first ISOL. Steve did 10 push-ups and for every person before they got their donuts. And down to the second ISOL, till Dr. Christensen came to Scott. Scott was on the basketball team. And in as good condition as Steve, he was very popular and never lacking for female companionship. Then Professor asked, Scott, do you want a donut? Scott's reply was, well, I can do my own push-ups. Dr. Christensen said, no, Steve has to do them. Then Scott said, well, I don't want one then. Dr. Christensen shrugged and then turned to Steve and asked, Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so Scott can have a donut that he doesn't want? With perfect obedience, Steve started to do 10 push-ups. Scott said, hey, I said I don't want one. Dr. Christensen said, look, this is my class, my desk, and these are my donuts. So just leave it on the desk if you do not want it. And he put a donut on Scott's desk. Now, by this time, Steve had begun to slow down a little. He just stayed on the floor between sets because it took too much effort to be getting up and down. You could start to see a little perspiration coming from out around his brow. Dr. Christensen started down the third row. Now the students were beginning to get a little angry. Dr. Christensen asked Jenny, do you want a donut? Sternly, Jenny said no. Then Dr. Christensen asked Steve, would you do 10 more push-ups so that Jenny can have a donut that she doesn't want? Steve did 10 and Jenny got a donut. By now, a growing sense of uneasiness filled the room. The students were beginning to say no. And there were all these uneaten donuts on the desk. Steve also had to really put forth a lot of extra effort to get these push-ups done for each donut. There began to be a small pool of sweat on the floor beneath his face. His arms and brow were beginning to get red because of the physical effort involved. Dr. Christensen started down the fourth row during his class. However, some students from other classes had wandered in and sat down on the steps along the radiators and ran down the sides of the room. When the professor realized this, he did a quick count and saw that now there were 34 students in the room. He started to worry if Steve would be able to make it. Dr. Christensen went on to the next person and the next and the next. Near the end of that row, Steve was having a rough time. He was taking a lot more time to complete each set. A few moments later, Jason, a recent transfer student, came to the room and was about to come in when all the students yelled in one voice, "No! Don't come in! Stay out!" Jason didn't know what was going on Steve picked up his head and said, "No, let him come in." Professor Christensen said, "You realize that if Jason comes in, you will have to do 10 push-ups for him." Steve said, "Yes, let him come in. Give him a donut." Dr. Christensen said, "Okay, Steve, I'll let Jason's out of the way right now. Jason, do you want a donut?" Jason, new to the room, hardly knew what was going on. "Yes," he said, "give me a donut." "Steve, will you do 10 push-ups? Will you do 10 push-ups so that Jason can have a donut?" Steve did 10 push-ups, very slowly and with great effort. Jason, bewildered, was handed a donut and sat down. Dr. Christensen finished the 4th row and started on those visitors seated by the heaters. Steve's arms were now shaking with each push-up in a struggle to lift himself against the force of gravity. Sweat was profusely dropping off his face, and by this time, there was no sound except his heavy breathing. There was not a dry eye in the room. The very last 2 students in the room were 2 young women, both cheerleaders and very popular. Dr. Christensen went to Linda, the second to last, and asked, "Linda, do you want a donut?" Linda said very sadly, "No, thank you." Professor Christensen quietly asked Steve, "Would you do 10 push-ups so that Linda can have a donut that she doesn't want?" Granting from the effort, Steve did 10 very slow push-ups for Linda. Then Dr. Christensen turned to the last girl, Susan. "Susan, do you want a donut?" Susan, with tears flowing down her face, began to cry. Dr. Christensen, "Why can't I help him?" Dr. Christensen, with tears of his own, said, "No, Steve has to do it alone. I have given him this task, and he is in charge of seeing that everyone has an opportunity for a donut, whether they want it or not." When I decided to have a party this last day of the class, I looked at my grade book. Steve is the only student with a perfect grade. Everyone else has failed a test, skipped a class, or offered me an inferior work. Steve told me that when a player messes up in the football practice, he must do push-ups. I told Steve that none of you could come to my party unless he had paid the price by doing your push-ups. He and I made a deal for your sakes. Steve, would you do 10 push-ups so that Susan can have a donut? As Steve very slowly finished his last push-up with the understanding that he had accomplished all that was required of him. Having done 350 push-ups, his arms buckled beneath him and he fell to the floor. Dr. Christensen turned to the room and said, "And so it was that our Savior Jesus Christ on the cross pled to the Father, 'Into thy hands I commend my spirit,' with the understanding that he had done everything that was required of him. He yielded up his life, and like some of those in this room, many of us leave the gifts on the desk uneaten. Two students helped Steve up the floor and to the seat, physically exhausted, but wearing a thin smile. "Well done, good and faithful servants," said the professor, adding, "Not all sermons are preached in words." And today, my brothers and sisters, I'm here to remind you that Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Everything to Jesus I owe, nothing of my own. Because sin had stained, it had made that stain that nothing else could remove. But He cleansed me and made me white as snow. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And now I'm welcoming each and every one of you. You know, you may have ignored this meal that Jesus has welcomed you to. But do not let him pass you by. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.